For years, there have been stories and reports from all across the United States, from the various national parks, from the various trail systems, from hikers and campers, even National Park Service members, National Forest Service members, of these groups of people that live just completely off the grid, secluded from society, that have a tendency to harass locals, harass hikers, steal items from camps. Most people brush these stories off as just being that, just stories, and Jordan was no different until 2007 when he was a rookie National Park Service member in the Great Smoky Mountains. But before we get into his story, welcome back to Dark Wilderness. If you've had an encounter or know a story that you would like to have shared here on the show, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And the next time you start going off into the woods chasing after a perp, grab that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. Jordan grew up right on the edge of a small town in rural Minnesota, and from a very young age, he just had an almost unmatched love for the outdoors. When he was growing up, while other kids his age would be playing video games, riding around on bikes, he was spending majority of his time wandering through the bush on his family's property, practicing bushcraft, building forts, learning as much as he could about all the different animals in the area, all the different plants. His lifelong dream, ever since he was a kid, was to one day become a park ranger. When he was 15, he did his very first solo hiking trip for 3 days, and it was during this trip when he realized that this was for sure what he wanted to do. He wanted to pursue a career as a park ranger. When he was 21, he got a position with the National Park Service out in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and he was stationed out in Big Creek. It did not take Jordan long at all to just absolutely fall in love with his new job. However, after about a month and a half of being on the job, he was starting to hear stories from hikers and from colleagues as well of weird stuff that would happen along the Appalachian Trail, which is a huge trail that runs pretty much through the entirety of the Appalachian Range, and it goes right through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He would hear stories from hikers of hearing voices calling out to them at night while they were camping off the trail, as well as hearing stories of items disappearing from camps, even though their camp would be set off 100 yards, 200 yards off the main trail and not at the actual shelters along the trail themselves. His colleagues as well would tell him some stories. However, majority of his colleagues would tell him, you know what, these are just stories, just completely ignore it. However, there was one fellow that he worked with that did say to him, he pulled him aside one day, and he said, you know what, do not brush all these stories aside. He said, I'm not going to tell you why, just don't brush them all aside. Just when you're off on your own, just always be alert. That kind of did not sit fully well with Jordan, because he was kind of wondering why his colleague would say that to him, kind of wondering like what his colleague was hiding from him and why his supervisors and the National Park Service itself would not have anything about these dangers, about what these hikers were coming across and what some of his colleagues told him, why they would not have that in some form of handbook for their employees. But he was very, very at home in the wilderness, so he figured, you know what, I could deal with whatever comes my way. I'm ready. I signed up for this. I'm good to go. Over the next couple of months, Jordan really settled into his new role, and he made a really good impression with his peers and with his supervisor. And very shortly after, he was able to start performing his duties completely on his own. He didn't need to be riding with another ranger, and he was really excited about this. Now, one of his weekly responsibilities was to go check on the Cosby Knob Fire Lookout Tower. The Cosby Knob Fire Lookout Tower, at one point in time, was an actual fire lookout tower that would be manned. There would be somebody in there kind of watching over the landscape, observing for fires. However, with more modern fire detection technology, having a person in these towers was no longer required, and that tower very quickly became deteriorated, and there was a massive restoration project to restore this lookout tower. And even today, now, The Cosby Knob Lookout Tower is one of the main tourist attractions in the eastern Smoky Mountains. On this particular day, he left the ranger station, he made the drive to the trailhead. At the trailhead parking lot, there was a small service road that kind of ran into the bush, just about 150, 200 yards, and that's where he would always go park his truck. So when he got into the parking lot, he made his way down this little service road, got towards the end, parked his truck, got out, he grabbed one of his packs. He always carried two packs with him in his vehicle. He had his own personal pack, which would contain his lunch, his personal water. And then he had another pack for when he would do hikes like this that contained water, some water purification tablets, some food, medical supplies, basically stuff that if he came across a hiker in need, he'd be able to help them out. It was just something that he was always taught growing up when he would be hiking, was you always bring extra with you in case you come across somebody in need. So that was something that just really stuck with him. So that was just something he made it a habit to do every time he was performing his duties when he would be going on a hike. So he grabbed the pack, put it on, locked his vehicle, and he started making his way towards the trail. He made his way down the trail. Again, it was about a 3.5, 4 mile hike. Got to the lookout tower. Everything at the tower seemed okay. There was no signs of break-ins, no signs of animal activity getting in, nobody inside. So he radioed to his colleague saying that the lookout tower was fine and that he was going to be heading back to his vehicle. So he took one last swig of water, put on his pack, and started making his way back to his truck. He was hiking for about an hour when all of a sudden behind him he could hear footsteps and voices coming up behind him pretty quick. So he stopped, turned around, and sure enough, he saw two hikers just hauling it down the trail. It was two males, slightly older than him. So he yelled out to them, identified himself as a park ranger, kind of signaled them over to him. Then he asked them if everything was all right. And they went on to tell him that for the last 2 nights, they were having weird things happen around their camps. They were hearing a woman screaming, they would hear other voices, and all night they would hear footsteps kind of going all through their camp. When that happened to them on the first night, that second night they decided they were going to set up camp off the trail, just figuring that it was probably other hikers just messing with them. But even on that second night, the same type of thing happened to them. And they went on to say that for that entire day, they kept hearing voices, like people talking in the woods as they made their way down the trail. And that at one point, shortly before they came across Jordan, that these people, these voices were getting really close behind them and they were starting to sound very aggressive, but they could not make out what they were saying. Jordan ended up telling the hikers just to continue down the trail, make their way back to that trailhead, to that parking lot, and that he would hang back and try to figure out who this was that was harassing them. Jordan stepped off the trail only about 10-15 yards, just enough that if anybody was coming down the trail, they would have a hard time seeing him, but he still had a full field of view of the trail itself. He waited for about 20 minutes. He did not see anybody. He did not hear anybody. And at this point, he pulled out his radio and he radioed over to his colleague. He told him exactly what those hikers had told him and that he had sent them on their way, and he hung back to try to figure out who these people were. His colleague at this point told him, "Don't hang around anymore, just get back to your truck." And Jordan was kind of like, well, I want to find out who's doing this, find out who's responsible. You know, I've heard stories of this happening before, and maybe it's the same group of people. His colleague at this point, in a very stern voice, just told him, "You're going to get back to your truck now." Jordan was kind of confused by this, but his colleague was technically his superior, so he's like, okay, I'm just going to head back to the truck. Reclipped his radio, made his way back onto the trail, and started heading the rest of the way back towards where he had parked. For the next couple of miles, as he made his way down the trail, he would periodically stop, turn around, look behind him to see if there was any sign of those people at all. And every time he would turn around, he did not see anybody, he did not hear anybody. And the entire time as he was walking, his colleague's words just kept echoing in his head, and he was really trying to figure out why his colleague had been so stern with him just to get back to the truck. In Jordan's mind, he was a park ranger, he was armed, he had nothing to worry about. So as he continued down the trail, he just kept thinking about that the entire time, and he was just kept telling himself, I have nothing to worry about, I'm armed, I'm a ranger, I'm good. When he got closer towards where his truck was parked, it was already pretty late in the day. It was about a half an hour before dark. And he got to a part of the trail where he had to leave the main trail and go down this much narrower trail towards that service road. So when he got there, he turned, started making his way down that narrow trail. And after a few minutes, he could see his truck starting to come into view. Once he started getting a little bit closer, he noticed that the driver's side door was open. He could see that even though he was looking at the passenger side of the truck, he could tell that the driver's side door was open. He kind of stopped for a second looking towards the truck because he remembered locking it. So now he's thinking, great, somebody's broken into the truck. So he starts making his way a little bit closer, takes a few more steps, when all of a sudden he notices there's movement in the cab of the truck. He could see somebody moving around from the driver's side, kind of rummaging through everything on the passenger side and the center console area. At this point, he did not want to alert whoever this was going through his truck. He decided he was going to kind of try to get around them and kind of catch them by surprise and have them in a position where he could identify if they had a weapon, if they were a threat, and who they were. And he would be able to control the situation from there. So he very quietly snuck through the bushes trying to get around towards the backside of his truck. Once he got behind the truck, he came out of the bush, he had his hand on his sidearm just in case, and started to make his way around the back of the truck so he could see towards the driver's side door. As the driver's side door came into view, Jordan just kind of stopped, eyes wide, just kind of in shock of what he was seeing in front of him. He was looking at this completely naked man rummaging through his truck. All he could see of this guy was from his butt down to his feet, and the guy was completely naked and completely filthy. Jordan stood there for a second, not really knowing how to respond. He was just absolutely in shock at this man going through his truck. He stood there for a second, hand still on his sidearm, and then he decided he was just going to identify himself and alert this man. So in the sternest voice that he could muster, he just let out, "Park Ranger." All of a sudden, this guy, without missing a beat, quickly stood up, turned, ran directly at him. This guy was, again, just completely naked, completely filthy. He had long hair that was just completely matted, unkept, just full of dirt. Jordan did not have time to react as this guy was running at him. He didn't even have time to pull his weapon from his holster when this guy just slammed into him, knocking Jordan onto the ground. Jordan's on the ground looking up at this completely naked, dirty man on top of him, and the guy just pushes down on him, gets up, and just runs for the trees. Jordan very quickly scrambles up, draws his weapon, and starts pursuing him into the woods. He made his way about 100 yards, trying to stay as close towards this guy as he could, but he had no line of sight on him. He could hear him running, but he could not see him at all. Jordan at this point decides he's going to slow down so that he can follow this guy from sound versus sight. And when he started to slow down, all of a sudden he notices that he could hear not just movement from this guy, but he could hear movement all around him. Jordan at this point knew he was not in a good situation. He had no idea how many people were around. He had no idea if they were armed. And he knew he did not come from, a policing background. He did not come from a military background. He had never been in a situation like this before. So he figured his best option in this moment was just to stay completely still, completely silent, have his weapon ready, and just listen so he could hear if any of these people came closer to him, if anybody was going to come up from behind him. He sat there for several minutes. Now the woods were starting to get pretty dark because the sun was going down, and he knew that he needed to do something. So he grabbed his radio. He radioed his colleague that he had talked to before. He told him that he had been in pursuit of somebody that had broken into his truck, that had just assaulted him as well, and now he was in the woods completely surrounded by, he didn't know how many people, he didn't know who, he didn't know if they were armed. His colleague in this moment told him, just get out of there as fast as you can, get back to the truck, and I'll meet you on the way back to the station. I'm on my way to you now. Jordan at this point knows that he needs to get back to the truck, but he did not know if he should just fire a couple of shots, maybe try to scare these people away, or if he should try to be more stealthy and try to sneak out. So he decided he was going to try to stealthily sneak back to his truck. So with his weapon at the ready, he stood up, started backing up very slowly through the bush. And as he was doing that, he could hear all those sounds, all that movement that was all around him, kind of converging into one central location directly in front of him. He could hear the sounds. The sound sounded like the movement was about 20, 30 yards off, but he could not see anything that far at this point. The woods were just absolutely too dark with the sun that had gone down. So with his service weapon up, he just kept backing up out of the bush. Once he got onto that service road, he turned around, booked it directly to the truck, jumped in, started it, but then he had to do like a multi-point turn to be able to turn around. He didn't want to risk backing the truck down this trail. There were too many spots where he could get stuck, where he could go off the trail. So he was really forced to do this multi-point turn. When he was almost fully complete that turn, his light shone into the bush, and he saw that there were actually 6 of these people. And just like the guy that had been rummaging through his truck, they were all completely naked and just absolutely filthy. When he saw that, he just pinned the truck, so he kind of fishtailed the back end out, took off down the service road, made it to the highway, and when he was on his way back to the ranger station, he came across his colleague coming the other way. They kind of pulled their trucks off to the side of the highway. His colleague got out of his truck, climbed into his, and started talking about what Jordan had just experienced. When his colleague got in the truck, one of the first questions he asked was, "Is anything missing?" And Jordan at this point didn't know, so he started looking around his truck and realized that no, nothing was missing, but his personal pack that he always carried, his personal food, his snacks, his lunch, had been rummaged through, and a lot of the stuff that had been in that pack was partially eaten and all over the floor of the truck. He did not notice that when he jumped in, just because he was on a pure adrenaline high at this point when he got to the truck. His colleague then said to him, "Remember how I told you not to brush these stories off? This is why." He then told him, "I'm going to tell you something, but it stays just between us." And he went on to tell him that the higher-ups were very aware of these groups of people living in the park way off the grid that had lived there for years, possibly for generations, and that him and all the other rangers were instructed never to talk about them. And if they ever came across anybody reporting to see these people, to tell them that they would just look into it, and if anything ever came of it, that they would just play it off as some homeless person or a group of homeless people in the bush. Well, that's it for today's encounter. This story matches a lot of similar stories that I have heard of feral people in the national parks, especially in the Smoky Mountains. But I really like to know your guys' thoughts on this. So if you haven't done so already, don't forget to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.